talked about for a student, and you have 100 or so students, it's probably nice to have different objects representing each of those students. Alternatively, you could have a students object, inside of which is maybe an array, but that's getting a little messy, right? The idea of actually modeling real-world entities with classes is so that you can model each independently. So in the singleton model, though, you only have one instance of a given class. So this probably isn't really appropriate for a student class, but you've actually been using a singleton pattern the past week or two in the context of CodeIgniter. Can you think of an example where there's apparently only one of something or of one class? Yeah. OK, so one course. Yeah, so quite possibly. So if you have a model called course, and you call CodeIgniter's load method so that you can then access the course object as this arrow course, absolutely. That's a case of the singleton pattern. And the one that comes for free, even if you haven't even implemented the notion of a course, is the database connection. So we used the database class in CodeIgniter last week. You've probably been using it, or might be using it if you're using MySQL for your project. So when you say this arrow DB for database, that's a singleton object. And you configure that singleton object where? Well, not through parameters, but it's through like the database.php file. Recall you had to go in there once, or you or your partner had to add your username and your password and the like. So you configure that, and then CodeIgniter magically hands you one object. And so CodeIgniter is a big fan of this, for better or for worse, of passing you single instances of most classes. But CodeIgniter gets a little messy in that even if you have the notion of a course or a student or an instructor, CodeIgniter tends not to use a course object or a student object or an instructor object. It rather just hands you back from the database standard class object. So if unfamiliar, know that PHP has this very generic class called standard class. And this is the equivalent of Java's object class, if you took APCS or similar. So it's sort of a base class that is just a very generic way of putting stuff inside of some container. It's like a struct in C, but it can, in theory, also have methods associated with it. At least it can once you start defining one more precisely. So in short, singletons are when you have just one instance of a class. Why is this useful? It doesn't seem useful in the case of a student, necessarily. When would you want, or why would you want only one of something, perhaps? Let's use the database example. Why might it be compelling to only have a single database object that you access throughout your code? Yeah? OK, so you don't have to change your configuration options anytime. You create this object once, or in the case of CodeIgniter, it does it somewhere for you among its many files that have been written for you. They just configure it once and hand it to you. So that's compelling. Yeah? OK, so you don't have to trace problems that you might have back to multiple potential sources. You can go straight to the class or the object in question.
Does that have anything to do with just like the amount of queries you might make if you set up multiple instances of one object and like the data that can be tied up?
Yeah, so this is getting a little better and a little more compelling, I think, now technologically. The reality is that when you talk to a database, you might want to issue multiple selects, multiple inserts, multiple deletes. But what you probably don't need to do again and again is call MySQL connect or MySQL select DB. So think back to CS50 when we used those methods in particular, which were very much hard-coded for MySQL. Now, CodeIgniter uses its own abstraction layer, so to speak, for database connection. So you can use Oracle or MySQL or something else. It genericizes the functions. But you probably, every time you issue a select in your Harvard Courses tool, you don't want to have to connect to the database, select the database, and then issue your select query, and then do this again and again, certainly not in some loop. So it's compelling to maybe have one instance of an object if that object is already doing something useful that only needs to be done up front. So in the case of the singleton model, you might connect to the database, select the specific database you want to use on that server, and then thereafter, you want all queries to be routed through that same object. You just don't need to have multiple connections. Now, conversely, what's a downside that derives from this same logic? What's bad about the singleton model? Yeah?
If you wanted to connect like, to more than one database.
Perfect. Yeah, right. Just as it's an advantage, it's also arguably a disadvantage if you actually want to talk to multiple databases. Now, in the apps you've done in 50 and are probably working on now, there's not necessarily a motivation to talk to multiple databases at once. But certainly as a project grows in size and has even more classes and controllers and models, feels like it'd be compelling to be able to at least have the ability to connect to multiple databases. And the singleton pattern tends to get in the way of that. And also when it comes to testing, it can also introduce issues that we'll see perhaps over time when we move to that particular topic. So DAO, data access objects. So this is kind of a fancy, unenlightening way of describing a very common model. And in fact, what CodeIgniter calls models are kind of reflective of this particular pattern. This model essentially prescribes that you have a class that, for now, this is an oversimplification, has a whole bunch of helper methods inside of it. So if you want to have a model in CodeIgniter called courses, well, inside of that courses class, you might have a method like get courses, get instructors, get day, get time, things that, or rather get times, things that are related to courses as a whole. But let me wave my hand at this for a moment, and we'll come back to this in more detail with some actual code. What about active record? Those of you with experience beyond PHP for web programming, where do you see this a lot? Oh, I think I heard it.
Basically, it's a way to access the database without doing sort of like manual queries. So,
OK, good.
Basically, it's sort of like a wrapper around what your database model is, and it gives you a bunch of very convenient methods for interacting with it.
OK.
And depending on what your database is, it could be very different. It's not like you're actually messing with the database. It's
OK.
just the interface for interacting.
OK, good. So let me oversimplify. So active record is a means of interacting with a database and reading and writing records, let's call them, or rows more concretely in a relational database, but without writing a lot of those queries yourself. Right? A lot of the queries you type for any SQL things actually follow this silly paradigm, CRUD, create, read, update, delete. This maps roughly to insert, select, update, and delete. But CRUD apparently sounded better. And there's different ways that communicate this exact same acronym. But it's a very common model, especially in relational databases, where there's really only 4 primary operations, the 4 CRUD operations. And so throughout your code, both for Project 0 and maybe even past projects you've worked on, you probably did issue a lot of selects and a lot of inserts and a lot of deletes. And certainly in a project like Project 0, if you have things like a course and an instructor and a location, any of these real-world entities, you might be copying a lot of the same code that differs only in terms of like the table name, maybe only in terms of the field name. So there's a lot of structural redundancy there. So active record is meant to abstract away a lot of those uninteresting operations for adding a record, deleting a record, updating a record, and just give you a class-based interface for doing those very common operations without ever actually touching SQL. Let me actually fast forward to a concrete example. In the active record model, and this is some PHP pseudocode, but it's actually syntactically correct. In active record, if you want to insert a new course into your database, you don't use the insert query for SQL. You instead create a new object, which in this case is called course. So capital C course. This, again, for those unfamiliar, when defining classes, and CodeIgniter messes this up a little bit, sometimes the class name should be capital C. This is the invocation of what's called the constructor, which is a method that is automatically invoked whenever you instantiate an object, create an object for the first time, that can, if you want, take arguments. But I've just chosen not to give it any arguments here. And the new keyword means actually allocate memory on the heap for this new object. All right, so this gives me essentially the empty container that is a course, but there's nothing inside of it. So how do I put stuff inside of it? Well, let me put a cat num of like 7295. And let me put a title of, oops, I'm missing a $sign. So I guess it is pseudocode. Now it's actually code. All right, so now I'm putting in the title of the course here, and then this is the magic or the abstraction that active record gives you. You just say save. And what the save method does, which was implemented maybe by you, but more likely by the framework that is automatically generating the requisite code for you, this will now create the equivalent of something like this SQL query without you having to care about the specifics. It will do something like insert into courses, something like catnum, title, and then values, 7295, comma, mobile, ... So it will induce that query for you. And similarly, can you update fields or delete records and the like? So this is active record.
Is there any advantage to like hard writing actual SQL queries as opposed to using active record?
Good question. Is there any advantage to actually writing the queries yourself? Short answer is it depends. For very simple queries like this, not really. And one of the reasons for the popularization of this active record model, especially in the Ruby on Rails community, is just it's so damn easy to do things quickly. You could whip up your own core shopping tool potentially much faster if you don't have to think about a lot of the queries and the database design and the like. But what you give up, arguably, is a lot of control. And if you're actually trying to really give a lot of thought to your schema design, to primary keys, foreign keys, and you know what the real world implications are for performance on doing selects in certain ways or doing joins in certain ways, you might not want to save your time by using this model at the expense of performance potentially. But again, for relatively simple websites where you're talking hundreds, thousands of users, and it's much more important to ship the thing within a week and move on to something else, these models can really help. Now, CodeIgniter does not really provide this model. In fact, they have a horrific, I think, implementation of this, whereby you actually use, for instance, your model class, which itself has a whole bunch of methods, like getCourses, and then you use this arrow. Actually, let's see if we can. Let me see if I can find the documentation in question so I can rant slightly for just a moment. CodeIgniter model. Let's see if it's this one. Yeah, so this. So I think this is horrific. So this is their, what's class, this class? And you can get the counterpoint, I'm sure, in section this week when Tommy is instead on the soapbox instead of me. So this is their blog model that extends CodeIgniter model. So you probably did something like this for your course or courses model thus far for the project. But then you have apparently these things here, which we'll talk a little bit, we'll see something like this in a little bit, where these are essentially public data members inside of this class. And then you have this construct method, which this is, for now, I'm going to wave my hand at. And then you have these things. So this method here, get last 10 entries, this method, based on its name and what it's actually doing, is actually consistent with this pattern data access objects, DAO. And we'll see this more concretely with our own code outside of the CodeIgniter framework. So this is actually pretty clean, right? Because then you would say this, arrow course, arrow get last 10 entries. And for me, I would call it courses, but the idea, or blog in this case, so this, the takeaway is the same. You have this sort of generic class called blog model, and you have this helper method inside of it that gets you something related to the blog. But then where they start blurring things in the interest of keeping things simple is then they do something like this, where similarly can use this exact same class and store inside of this particular instance of the class a whole bunch of fields like title and content and date. And then you can call this DB insert to insert yourself, the current model object, into the database. So this is very much like a blurring of these lines. Like it's both trying to do active record and it's also trying to do DAO, but it's just conceptually mixing metaphors, I think. Either the class should do things like your helper methods and talk to the database and get you blog entries or get you courses, or it should model some real world entity like the blog entry. This model here is trying to do both. Now on the flip side, learning CodeIgniter and actually making something with it is actually relatively fast compared to a lot of the more sophisticated alternatives. And I'll rattle off a few later today, but you'll be invited to use any framework or none at all for Project One, but just realize that the learning curve tends to be higher even if the implementation tends to be cleaner. So these are just tensions. There is rarely will you find any framework in life that you love. You're almost always going to hate it for some reason. And this is one of my pet peeves here.
Is that any PHP framework?
What's that? Yes, so it still has to be, like, we'd rather you not go off and implement things in Python or Ruby, just because it's useful on scale for us to at least use the same languages. But in terms of frameworks, we won't care for Project One. All right, so let's come back to this. So there's one sort of additional soapbox thing that I can say here. I personally have never liked this model, though I definitely see the utility of being able to do things so relatively easy. It's never kind of rubbed me the right way that I can create essentially an empty course object, which is called a course, but doesn't really represent a course yet. And then I have to manually put inside of it the requisite fields. And now this is actually a course that I can save to my database. To me, it's just a little messy if the approach you take is to sort of manually insert things in this way. Now, we'll see, especially in Objective-C, better use of constructors. So I actually would like this a little more, where you actually do something like 7295 mobile So this is, for those unfamiliar, an example of an explicit constructor that actually takes arguments. And in this model, when you create this empty container on the heap, because I've passed in arguments this time, now those arguments should be automatically put inside of the object. And for those unfamiliar, and we'll see an example of this today, if I wanted to implement this course method, let me just go ahead and put this in context so that this is indeed not just all pseudocode. If I had something like class course in PHP, what I can do here is public function __ construct. In PHP, anytime you have a double underscore, it means it's a special function reserved by the PHP